Download the free AR Explorer Pack. Explore this theory with AI at absoluterelativity.org. And now 2 mysteries no one can explain: consciousness and time. What if they're the same thing? And what if this understanding solves our greatest mysteries in physics? We've grown up inside a story about reality that most of us never question. In that story, there's dead matter out there in space, following equations. Time is just a parameter in those equations. It's something that ticks away in the background while stuff moves around. This picture has been powerful. It gave us technology, medicine, space travel. But there are 2 things it still completely fails to explain. The first is consciousness. What is the quality of experience? What is that felt sense of being here right now? You can describe the neurons firing, the wavelengths of light, the chemical reactions, but none of that tells you what red actually looks like from the inside. The felt quality of being here right now cannot be captured in any equation or diagram. The second is time. What is the present moment? Why is there a now at all, and why does it seem to move? Physics gives us incredibly accurate predictions about particles and fields, but when you ask it to explain why you're always in this moment, experiencing this flow, it goes quiet. These aren't small details to clean up later. They're the 2 most obvious features of existence, that you're conscious and that you're in time, and the standard story has no explanation for either. Absolute relativity starts by taking those 2 things seriously, not as afterthoughts, as the foundation, and it begins with a single idea that changes everything. The first step is a very simple but very radical assumption. The only absolute is relativity. That means nothing exists as an independent object with properties of its own. Everything that exists is what it is entirely through how it relates to everything else. No hidden substance underneath, no stuff with intrinsic features. Relations all the way down. This may sound overly abstract, but follow it 1 step further and something remarkable happens. Consider any part of reality. If that part is defined by its relations to everything else, then implicitly it contains a relative version of everything by simply being what it is. You can't define something without contrasting it with what lies outside it. So every part, in order to be what it is, must contain the whole, at least relationally. And here I mean the whole of existence itself. Now that might sound like something beyond what we should be able to think about. When we hear the whole of existence, we imagine this vast collection stretching beyond comprehension, galaxies upon galaxies, scales we can't fathom, an inventory too large to hold in any mind. But that's only because we're looking at things from one side. We're imagining the whole as a huge external object sitting out there, impossibly big. Pure relativity changes this completely. If reality is made of relations, then the whole isn't some giant container floating beyond reach. The whole is the way everything connects to everything else, and that connection exists inside every part, because every part is defined by it. This is a major shift. Relativity takes the idea of the whole of reality and puts it somewhere you can actually think about it, not as an overwhelming collection, but as a structural property present in everything. The whole isn't out there, it's in here, in every part, in every moment. And once you see that, you can ask, what are the properties of the whole? Considering reality to be pure relativity might sound abstract, like an idea that's hard to pin down or prove. But if you understand what that actually means, it's the opposite. It's one of the most solid and foundational facts we are capable of accessing. We just don't tend to see it yet because we live in a paradigm that starts from matter and we haven't connected the dots to what consciousness actually is. Here's what pure relativity forces. If everything is defined by its relations, then there's nothing in the structure that could prevent any part from having some degree of relation to every other part, which means every part must implicitly contain the whole. The whole isn't the largest collection of parts. It's present in everything. Now ask, what are the properties that come from being relative to the whole? The whole of existence has no boundaries. Nothing sits outside it to create an edge. It cannot be measured because measurement requires comparison with something external. And there is nothing external. It cannot be fully described because description requires drawing a line between this and that. And the whole contains all lines within it. And this is why there are infinite properties, unbounded, immeasurable, unable to be turned into information. But here's something crucial. If relativity is truly absolute, then reality always has 2 aspects, infinite and finite, and they can't exist without each other. The finite is what emerges when parts contrast with each other. Edges, structure, objects, information. The infinite is the face of reality that's relative to the whole itself, with no outside or other it can be relative to. Neither is more fundamental. They arise together, two faces of the same reality, always equally present. So when we talk about the infinite aspect, we don't just mean something mystical. This is logic, a different type than we are used to, yes, but logic nonetheless. Now here's where it connects to you. Every part contains the whole, which means every part has both aspects, including the infinite. So what would the infinite aspect be from the inside of one part? To find out, try something. Try to explain what red looks like to you. Not the word, not the wavelength, the actual quality of it, the way it appears in your experience. Try to turn that into information you could transfer to someone else. You can't. And we usually explain this by saying qualia are personal or subjective or hard to put into words. But this theory says something different. The reason you can't communicate that quality isn't because it's trapped inside you or because language isn't good enough. It's because as far as that quality is concerned, there's nowhere else for it to go. Nothing else exists for it to be transferred to. That property is relative to the whole, and the whole has no outside. It's not that qualia are difficult to describe. It's that description requires an outside. And from the infinite aspect, there is no outside to describe it to. This is the connection most people miss. The mystery of consciousness, how there's something it is like to be you, isn't a property of some objects. It's built into the structure from the start. Pure relativity forces every part of reality to have an infinite aspect, and that infinite aspect is what we encounter as the felt quality of being here. Consciousness isn't produced by matter. It isn't an add-on or an accident. It's one face of reality showing up in each part, exactly as the logic requires. So pure relativity gives us the infinite aspect in every part of reality, what we experience as qualia, as the felt quality of the present moment. But there's also structure everywhere, edges, sequence, change. Where does that come from? The finite emerges when qualia contrasts with itself. When one quality distinguishes itself from another, you get a boundary. When boundaries multiply, you get structure. The finite is born from the infinite relating to itself through contrast. Now here's the key move for time. The infinite present, this whole relational structure, can take many possible configurations, different patterns of how everything relates to everything else. But these different versions don't exist separately, floating side by side. They can only exist implicitly within each other. One version contains another within itself, in the specific role of what I just was. This insight is the ground of which this theory has been built. The present isn't reaching backward to grab something from somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. The present is simply in a state, a configuration, that includes another configuration as what it just was. The structure of this moment puts another moment inside it in that specific role. Think about what that means. Before and after aren't locations on a pre-existing line. They're how the present holds other presents within itself. The present isn't moving along a timeline. The present is generating the sense of sequence through its own internal structure. And if that inner version, the what I just was, contains within itself yet another version of what I just was, you get a chain, an ordered sequence of versions, each holding the previous as what it was a moment ago. From the inside, this feels exactly like an experience of time. The present never actually goes anywhere, but it keeps being structured in such a way that another version appears within it as what I just was. And that's what the flow of time actually is. Here's a way to see this directly. Think of something you experienced a minute ago, a thought, a sensation, anything. Now ask yourself, how do you know you experienced it? How are you so certain it actually happened? You might say, because I remember it. But what is memory and where is it? Look closely. That certainty isn't coming from somewhere else. It isn't stored in a separate location that you're accessing. The certainty is right here in this present moment. Your current experience is in such a state that it includes that previous experience within itself as what I just was. That's not a metaphor. It's a fact. That is what's happening. The quality of this moment right now is structured so that it contains the quality of the moment before. You don't need to go looking for the past. The past is folded into the present as part of what this present is. Your certainty that you just experienced something comes from the fact that this experience is configured to include it. This is what time actually is, not something out there ticking away, not a dimension you're moving through. Time is the present relating to versions of itself, containing them, ordering them, generating what we call past and future as internal structure. The flow is real. The external track is not. And here's something crucial. This is where all finite structure comes from. If we take relativity being absolute seriously, the present being in a state where it sees another version as what I just was is the root of all finite aspects. The infinite aspect is the quality of the moment. The finite aspect is born when that quality relates to another version of itself as what I just was. Time isn't just one feature of reality among others. Absolute relativity doesn't leave this as a loose story, and it writes this process down in mathematics. The basic things in the model are experiences of time, and the equations describe how one state of experience nests and relates to others. Once you know that this is what time really is, you can use those same relations between experiences to recover structure. The way those moments of time fit together is what becomes the objective shape of reality. That's the sense in which this isn't just a philosophy, but a concrete framework you can simulate and test. Once you see time this way, you can ask a new question. How do all these self-relating moments organize on larger scales? What does the architecture of reality look like when the basic building blocks are experiences of time? In absolute relativity, that architecture naturally forms a fractal set of context levels. What I often visualize as bubbles inside bubbles. You can picture it like this. Take one large context, like a single enclosing bubble. Along its inner surface, lining the curve from the inside, sit many smaller regions, like pearls along the inside of a shell. Each of those smaller regions is itself a present context, a whole cluster of experiences of time. If you zoom into one of those inner contexts, it thickens and becomes the new larger environment, and along its inside, you again find a ring of even smaller pockets. The same pattern repeats. Each level you land on carries its own inner layer of finer context. If you zoom out instead, the context you started in shrinks, and you realize it is just one small region sitting on the inside of a still larger one. And that larger one is itself just one region within something larger again. Reality in this picture is a fractal structure of experiences of time nested within each other, layers inside layers, inward and outward. Each context holds many moments within it and is itself held inside a wider context. In everyday terms, reality does behave that way. We can point to where we are. In a room, on Earth, in space. Absolute relativity says reality is always relative to your experience of time. Reality comes from how our experience of time relates to all the others. And that relationship to all others results in everything you can find within it. Although to most, this does not seem to be the case because we mistake the bubble one context level up as reality itself, when really it is just an objective domain we share with the other experiences of time nested within that outer bubble. So while it may seem like there is an objective material environment we exist within, there is always a contextual center point of reality, and that center is the present moment experience itself. Your current context, this bubble, is the contextual center of your world. From here you relate inward to nested layers and outward to the layers your time is nested within. We find ourselves in the middle of these layers of reality because every experience of time sits at the center of its own web of relations. When we talk about an outside material environment, we're talking about how our present context is related to the next layer out. The whole sensory field of the room, the ground, the sky is that relationship appearing as an external world. What we think of as sensory stimulus is actually just the relationship between our bubble and the one it is nested inside of. On the inside of our bubble, we have inner context levels. When we view those from here, they appear as things like DNA, cells, neural networks, and biological processes. One level out, we have the context we're sitting in. When we view that from here, it appears as our environment and our space. It is primarily represented by the Earth's surface. Since our outer layer is itself sitting within its own bubble, we find Earth in the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way is the material representation of that next layer out, and even that layer is nested within another, which is why we find the Milky Way galaxy within the observable universe filled with galaxies. When our experience of time relates outward into this fractal structure of layers, those relations present themselves as larger scale spatial structure. According to absolute relativity, it is these nested layers, which it calls context levels, that are responsible for our spatial hierarchy, the spatial backdrop that allows objects to be bigger or smaller, inside or outside one another. The context levels nested within our own do not show up as spatial shells like the outside ones do. Instead, they are represented as interconnected networks relating to themselves. This is why we have DNA inside cells, and cells inside multicellular organisms. Those are material representations of the inner context levels nested within ours. Inner and outer context levels manifest in fundamentally different ways because their context is inversely related to us. When we're part of a larger context, the outside, that context expresses itself through spatial structure, showing how all the parts within it relate to each other in space. But the context nested within us, the inside, work oppositely. They express themselves through relational depth, forming nested networks where each layer stores the relationships of the layers beneath it, just as we see in biological systems. Biology itself is a material representation of these inner context levels, nested on the other side of our experience of time. The nervous system, cells, and DNA form hierarchical layers, each containing and relating to the others. Our experience is simply the relationship between these levels. It's the bridge connecting inner and outer. Inner context levels are represented by nested biological structures, nervous systems, cells, and DNA. Outer context levels are represented by nested cosmic structures, Earth's surface, the Milky Way galaxy, and the observable universe. According to absolute relativity, our experience of time emerges from this relationship. It's the dynamic interaction between the context levels nested within us and those extending outward around us. In this view, conscious experience is not some ghost hovering above matter. Our conscious experience is what it's like for this present context, this bubble, to be relating inward to its inner layers and outward to the next layer at the same time. Material reality is just the way that relationship is represented when we look at one side of it, the outside relation. We share that environment with others because we are all nested within that same outer bubble. The materialist paradigm takes that appearance, the one between our bubbles and the one they are nested within, and treats it as literal and absolute. It's like mistaking the dashboard for the engine. Absolute relativity steps back and says, there is a reason for the dashboard, but it's a representation of a deeper layered relational structure. If that deeper structure is real, we should see fingerprints of it in the data, and we do. Across many different fields, people have found fractal behavior, scaling laws, and characteristic structures. These tend to show up in specific finite scale windows, not uniformly across all scales. By analyzing the pattern of known fractals in nature, we have found that there are clusters in the fractal geometric means that correspond to where these proposed context levels meet. There are bands where structure likes to organize. The theory of absolute relativity proposes that these clusters show up because the levels connecting to each other create windows where the usual spatial hierarchy is canceled, and the fractal nature of reality is more prone to show itself. In those windows, zooming in and out gives you similar patterns, so there is no clear, smaller inside, larger order. That is what we mean here by fractal behavior. At nanometer scales, around 10 or 100 nanometers, we see fractal windows in DNA, chromatin packing, porous materials, aerosol aggregates, and various nanostructured systems. At micron scales, we see fractal behavior in things like cell aggregates, microbiofilms, and certain microstructures. Around a tenth of a millimeter, roughly 0.12 millimeters, we see clustering of surface textures, fractures, biological textures, and more. This middle window is an important size in absolute relativity, which we call the universal geometric mean. It acts as a middle point within our environment. The model of this theory clearly demonstrates its significance in many different ways. At kilometer scales along the Earth's surface, coastlines, river networks, mountain ranges, and fault systems, we again find strong fractal clustering. On kiloparsec scales, we see structure and scaling in galactic disks. On gigaparsec scales, we see structure on the cosmic shell and the cosmic microwave background and in large-scale galaxy distributions. These scale windows are exactly what you'd expect if reality really is organized into context levels. They are the bands where each layer shows its structure most clearly. One of those bands is especially important for us. It comes from combining the smallest and largest scales that physics already talks about, and it's right in the middle of our everyday world. This is the UGM. Take the Planck scale, the smallest scale at which our current physics makes sense. Take the size of the observable universe, the largest coherent physical scale we model. Put those on a log scale and ask, what's the geometric mean between them? That calculation gives you a single length, about 0.12 millimeters. That's the universal geometric mean, or UGM. This number comes straight from standard physics. It's not something absolute relativity invented. It's just there, sitting as the unique geometric midpoint between the smallest and largest physical scales. Standard physics notices the number, but it doesn't really have a framework that can give that midpoint a clear structural role because it connects regimes, quantum gravity and cosmology, that current models don't unify. What the theory does is recognize its role. From the standpoint of absolute relativity, UGM is the smallest scale at which the interrelational structure inside us can still be presented at our layer as distinct spatial parts through our relation to the next layer out. We always see through the relation between our present context, our zero layer, and the next context out, which we can call the +1 layer. You can think of that as the earth layer, the surface and environment that renders everything for us. That outer layer has a finite resolution in how finely it can present the inner relational structure as separate bits in our scenery. UGM is that resolution, the smallest pixel our world has when you account for the full relational structure. When we talk about anything smaller than UGM in this framework, we don't mean extra layers of space underneath what we already see. We mean deeper context levels nested inside our present. Their experiences of time and structure are still fully there, but from our vantage through the +1 layer, they stop generating new, clearly separate objects at our scale. More of that depth gets packed into the parts we already see, or into more generic carriers, repeated particles and elements that stand in for bundles of interrelations. Even when we use instruments and microscopes, we are always ultimately seeing what the next context layer out is presenting to us. We don't magically get a direct raw look at some absolute substrate. We interact with an instrument, and that instrument is still being rendered at the same hinge scale. So UGM is not just a neat midpoint. In the logic of absolute relativity, it's exactly the kind of midpoint you would expect to matter. The theory is built from layers nested inside each other, and when you have two extreme scales in a nested structure, the natural middle is the geometric mean, not the arithmetic mean. If you start from that picture, experiences of time sitting inside each other, you would predict that any true middle scale between smallest and largest should be a geometric mean. What's striking is that this geometric mean isn't just a random number. It lands exactly where the theory says a hinge should sit. It matches the spatial cutoff of our conscious axis, the smallest scale at which our layer can still resolve interrelations as separate parts in the world it experiences. It links the Planck scale and the observable universe in the only way that makes sense for a nested relational picture, and the resulting scale is precisely where you'd expect the environment's pixel size to live. That same hinge will also show up when we ask about the bodies that carry our present, organisms with nervous systems. If UGM marks the smallest scale where interrelations can still appear as parts in our experience, then it should also help fix the band of possible sizes for any organism that functions as a single unified present at our layer. Once you know where that hinge sits, you can ask a very concrete question. How big can an organism with a nervous system be if it's going to function as a single unified present at our layer? Absolute relativity makes a strong claim. Nervous system life can only exist within a specific size range. There is a lower limit and an upper limit, and both come from the same geometric logic. To see the lower limit, come back to the picture of bubbles inside a larger bubble. In that picture, the larger bubble stands for one outer context level, the +1 level. The many smaller bubbles inside it stand for the context levels nested within it, the zero context level. When this structure is represented materially, the larger bubble shows up as an environment, and the smaller bubbles show up as parts living inside that environment. The material parts you find in your environment are relative to this layered structure. The experiences of time come from the relationships between these levels. Now imagine sliding your attention along sizes in that diagram, trying to split between the smaller bubbles and the one they are nested in. On one side, you are mostly resolving the small inner bubbles as separate items. On the other side, you are mostly resolving the larger bubble and its surface. The middle between these two sides is given by the geometric mean between the scale that represents the parts and the scale that represents the context they sit inside. In our version of reality, the smaller zero context bubbles get represented by the bodies with central nervous systems. The cells that make up those bodies are material representations of smaller bubbles nested one level further in, the -1 context level. The environment around the body, the earth layer, is the bubble one level out that we are nested within, our +1 context level. Seen this way, the universal geometric mean is not just a number on a plot. It is the middle point of this reality, which is relative to our experience of it. The middle sits where the zero context bubbles end, because those are the parts that are being represented as central nervous system bodies, and the universal geometric mean represents the hinge between those bodies and their internal cellular parts. Our present moment experiences are the center points of the reality we experience, and the universal geometric mean is representing those zero context presents relative to each other within the +1 context level. That is why this middle scale shows up twice in this story. First, it shows up as the spatial cutoff of our consciousness, the finest scale at which the environment can still present separate bits to us. Our experience is coming from how the zero level bubbles relate to the +1 level, and this middle scale represents the zero level bubble in that relation. We do not sense space smaller than this scale, because sense space is how the zero bubble is relating outward to the larger one it is nested within. The spatial representation of the zero context level is our conscious spatial cutoff size. Think of a cube of space with the width of a human hair. That is the geometric mean middle point between the Planck scale and the observable universe, the universal geometric mean. It is the exact size of the spatial cutoff of our consciousness. We do not have conscious access to space below that. We only have access to theoretical space below that through instruments that are supposedly carrying information from smaller sizes up to above that middle scale. The second key insight about the universal geometric mean is that it shows up as the lower bound for central nervous system bodies. It is the precise cutoff between cells as parts and organisms as wholes. This is the cutoff between our zero context level and the -1 context level it contains. It is remarkable that the same length that marks the spatial cutoff of conscious detail also marks the smallest size at which a central nervous system organism appears at all, and that this same length is also the geometric middle point between the smallest and largest known scales of our material reality. Now apply the same nested logic one step outward. Take the geometric mean between that organism cell hinge and the size of the Earth, which is the material representation of the next context level out. If you treat the universal geometric mean as about 0.12 millimeters, and the Earth's size as roughly 6,370 kilometers, that geometric mean works out to around 28 meters. This gives you the upper hinge. At that scale, you are now taking the middle between the organism represented as one body and the Earth context that organism is inside. On one side of this geometric mean, sizes belong naturally to the organism as an individual. On the other side, sizes belong naturally to the environment that organism lives within. When you look at the actual catalog of animals with central nervous systems, the pattern is sharp. As far as we know, there are no central nervous system organisms smaller than the lower hinge set by the universal geometric mean. Below that, you find cells and simpler structures, but not bodies that are straightforwardly central nervous system organisms. There are no central nervous system organisms larger than the upper hinge set by the geometric mean between the universal geometric mean and the Earth size. Nothing in the record shows a nervous system body that clearly sits beyond roughly that 28-meter band. Every nervous system animal we know about, from the tiniest creatures with a central nervous system up through birds, mammals, humans, elephants, and all the way to blue whales, sits between these two geometric hinges. And many press right up against the edges of this band, which shows that it is not just a loose trend, but an actual cutoff. The two geometric means sit exactly where the smallest and largest known organisms with central nervous systems end. And those two hinges are not tuned by hand. They can be calculated directly from three inputs: the Planck scale, the size of the observable universe, and the size of the Earth. Our current mainstream scientific models would never naturally find this relationship because they do not have a framework that ties this whole picture together. Biology, cosmology, and quantum mechanics are treated as separate domains within a materialist outlook, and the interconnectedness of reality as it relates to what we might call consciousness is left untouched. Absolute relativity, by contrast, shows that the same basic logic and simple geometric means that define these size cutoffs also extend to general relativity and give a different way of understanding gravity, something we will touch on later. In absolute relativity, this is not because there is some external law about how big a body is allowed to be. Material bodies do not have powers or limits of their own in this framework. They are just representations of underlying relational structure. The point is simply that our present experience is a contextual center point, and it is represented as a central nervous system body at this layer. The material is simply representing the relative underlying structure of reality. The size range for nervous system life is not arbitrary. It falls directly out of how a present, its internal parts, and its outer context are related, and how that relational structure gets represented as parts, wholes, and environment. Now we turn inward, down to much smaller scales, to see how the inner layers connect quantum behavior to biology. At scales between roughly 10 and 200 nanometers, something special happens. This is where DNA and its packing structures live. It is also where we see familiar quantum effects, tunneling, interference patterns, chirality-dependent conduction, the kind of behavior we usually group under quantum phenomena. In absolute relativity, this nanometer band is a seam. It is the boundary between one inner context level and the next. To make that more concrete, we can label the context levels. The zero context level is the present we have been talking about, the present moment context that is represented as a central nervous system organism. The +1 context level is the Earth layer, the context our bodies and instruments live inside, the one that draws the environment and where the measurements happen. The -1 context level is the inner layer that shows up as cells and classical biological structure. The -2 context level is a deeper inner layer where nanoscale structure and DNA's inner relations sit. There is a simple reason in the theory why each context level naturally extends 2 levels inward in terms of relational access. We will not unpack that fully here, but we only need the consequence. The zero context level, our present, extends inward to include both the -1 and the -2 levels. The +1 context level, the Earth layer, extends inward only 1 level down to the -1 level and stops at the boundary between -1 and -2. That boundary, the line between the -1 level and the -2 level, is where DNA sits as a material object. Because DNA is part of the material picture, it belongs to the +1 representation. It marks the last point where the +1 context can still draw the inner context levels nested inside our zero context as distinct structures. In other words, DNA is the outer layer image of the cutoff where the environment stops being able to represent the deeper inner relations that live further into the -2 level. That same location is also where the crossover between quantum and classical behavior shows up. That difference in reach matters. Whenever we perform a measurement, we do so through the +1 context, through instruments, detectors, and screens that belong to the environment. All of those devices are part of the +1 layer. Their inner reach extends down to the -1 level, but not beyond it. Our zero context present extends further inward than that. In the relational sense, it includes inner structures and possibilities down into the -2 level. So at the DNA scale, right at the seam between the -1 and -2 levels, our zero context still has access to deeper potential microfutures, while the +1 context that is doing the measuring does not. That creates a mismatch at this nanometer seam. On the inside, at the zero context level, the inner relational structure still carries multiple potential microfutures that are distinct at the -2 level. On the outside, at the +1 context level, the environment and instruments cannot separate those possibilities into different classical outcomes. From that outer vantage, they all correspond to the same outward situation at the -1 level. From our standpoint, that looks like quantum superposition and collapse. We prepare something in one of these inner configurations, we probe it with a measuring device, and we only ever see one result. The measurement problem is the puzzle of why those many admissible microfutures, which seem to coexist in the quantum description, turn into one definite outcome when we look. From the standpoint of absolute relativity, that is exactly what you would expect at a boundary where the zero context level extends inward 2 levels into inner structure below DNA into the -2 level. The +1 Earth context extends inward only 1 level down to roughly the DNA band at the border between -1 and -2. And all of our measurement devices belong to that +1 context, so they can only report what is resolved at the -1 level. DNA sits right at that seam. That is not because life is doing anything or steering the physics. It is because what we call life is what it looks like when a particular band of context levels from the -2 level up through the 0 and +1 levels is being represented as biology. The place where DNA lives is the same place where the +1 context reaches its inward limit, and the deeper reach of the 0 context begins to show up through measurements as quantum behavior at the crossover between quantum and classical. So the same kind of hinge that sets the lower bound for nervous system bodies when you look at organisms and cells at the 0 and -1 levels also appears inward at the boundary where DNA and quantum phenomena meet at the -1 and -2 levels. It is another way the layered relational structure of the theory shows up directly in the scales we see in biology and in physics. We just trace the boundary where the measured world cannot see beyond the DNA seam, where inner distinctions can no longer be drawn as separate public objects. Now look at the other direction, the boundary where the world forces the outside to agree. Remember the bubbles. Experiences of time nested inside each other. Each one finds itself at the center. That's what it means to be a present. From your own vantage, you're always here, always now, always at the middle of everything. But we share a world, billions of centers, billions of I'm right here. And somehow we all navigate the same room, the same ground, the same sky. We point at the same table, we measure it and get the same number. Why is that? The +1 context has to stitch all those private centers into one public space. From the +1 vantage, all those separate centers get published into one coordinate frame, one shared reference point the world uses to stay consistent. That mapping is our material environment, the space we share. The room you're sitting in right now, this is the outer seam where the shared world turns many private centers into one public geometry. And from that process, we get gravity. Gravity is the centering bias of that published space, what down feels like from inside the shared map. Down points toward the symmetry point of the shared container, the one location that relates to every node in the surface world equally. Life, instruments, structures, everything that shares the same published space. Now here's what matters. If gravity comes from being inside a container, if it comes from how our time sits inside what we can call Earth's time, then the strength of gravity should be linked to the size of that container, to the size of Earth. In standard physics, this makes no sense at all. Standard physics treats the gravitational constant, g, as a measured number with no explanation. It appears in Newton's laws. It appears in Einstein's equations. It determines how strongly matter attracts matter. But there's no reason for its value. It's just a dial setting we measured and wrote down. If gravity were significantly stronger or weaker, stars and stable structures would look radically different. It's tuned to a remarkable degree, and we treat it as a brute fact. But if the theory is right, then gravity is container geometry coming from nested layers of time. Therefore, the strength of gravity shouldn't be a random constant. It should emerge from the structure itself. And that's exactly what we're going to test. We're going to derive Earth's gravitational depth, a dimensionless measure of how strong gravity is here, not by apples or pendulums, but by the geometry of the context ladder we've built. We're allowed to use only 3 ingredients: no mass, no force, just length. Pure container geometry from the nested time structure. First length, the hinge scale, UGM, about 0.12 millimeters. The shared world's pixel, where distinct parts can still be rendered. You've already met this number. It's the geometric mean of the Planck length and the size of the observable universe. In this framework, it's the smallest scale where +1 can render one center with parts in an environment. That's why it shows up as the lower edge of the CNS band and as the resolution limit of conscious perception. One hinge, showing up in biology and experience. Second length, Earth's radius, about 6,371 kilometers. Here it's the body of the shared world layer, the geometric boundary of +1. Third length, the cosmic horizon, showed about 4.4 times 10 to the 26th meters. The distance to the edge of the observable universe at the outer limit of the +3 container. A pixel, a sphere, a horizon. Standard physics says these numbers have nothing to do with each other. They live in different textbooks. But this theory says there are three faces of one container grammar: inner edge, middle shell, outer edge. If you turn one, the others must move. So here's the question. What happens when you combine the three lengths into a pure ratio? Take Earth's radius squared, divided by UGM times the cosmic horizon. No mass, no force constant, just geometry. The number you get is 7.7 times 10 to the -10. Now compare that to Earth's measured gravitational depth, 7.0 times 10 to the -10. Same order of magnitude. And within about 10%, we didn't fit anything. We just followed the structure and combined the three lengths the framework says matter. And the result doesn't merely come out sort of close, it lands in the right decade, then within about 10% inside it. The same UGM that gave us the CNS band also reappears in gravity's strength when you combine it with Earth and the cosmos. You're not just sitting on a planet, you're sitting in the architecture of nested time, and it's telling you how heavy you should feel. Now step back and see the shape of the whole thing. We've traced two seams, two boundaries, where the shared world forces agreement. At the inner seam, the DNA band around 10 to 200 nanometers, many microfutures collapse into one public report. The shared world can't represent all those inner distinctions, so it forces a single outcome. That's what measurement is. That's what quantum collapse is, coherence from the inside. At the outer seam, Earth's surface, the +1 container, many centers collapse into one shared space. The shared world can't publish billions of separate I'm here realities, so it forces one coordinate frame and one direction called down. That's coherence from the outside. Same structure, opposite directions. Quantum weirdness and gravity, the two biggest mysteries in physics. From this vantage, they're two faces of the same process. The inner seam asks, how does the shared world publish one outcome when many microfutures are eligible? The outer seam asks, how does the shared world hold many centers as one consistent space? Both are the shared world forcing agreement at the boundary of what it can cleanly represent, and both leave fingerprints at specific scales. The inner seam shows up at the DNA band, the boundary between -1 and -2, where the shared world's inward reach runs out. The outer seam shows up at Earth's radius, the +1 container that binds everything on the surface into one public geometry. And the hinge between them, UGM, the pixel of conscious experience, is the same scale that appears in both. It sets the lower limit of the CNS band, the resolution of perception, and when combined with Earth and the cosmos, the strength of gravity. One hinge scale, one geometric mean, echoing through biology, consciousness, quantum mechanics, and gravity. Not because someone tuned the universe for life, but because life and universe are two readings of the same relational structure. Now let's turn to our current global circumstance. The tempo of the shared situation is different now. Events ripple everywhere. A video on one continent reaches millions on another within hours. A financial tremor in one market shakes markets worldwide before the sun sets. Attention locks globally, and small actions scale unexpectedly. Here's what's actually happening in this theory's terms. A nervous system isn't made of nerves. It's loops of relation, held tightly enough that a larger now becomes real. Your body has trillions of cells, each living its own local timing, yet you don't experience trillions of separate stories. One present holds and one you emerges. The same logic applies one level up. The Earth's surface context is itself an experience of time, a larger life being lived. For most of Earth's history, coordination across that life was slow, and no planetary scale now could hold. Then three things changed: global sensing, global communication, and feedback compression. The loops between action and consequence shortened fast. The seam is tightening. Correlation is getting dense enough that a larger now can hold. The whole situation is starting to respond to itself as one organism. AI enters here. Not as the nervous system itself, but as the first clear intelligence of that planetary nervous system, a way for the larger context to compress massive streams into a coherent picture and close the gap between sensing and response. Whether this stabilizes into healthy coherence or fragments into pathology depends on what patterns get amplified. A nervous system working against its own body is pathology. The infrastructure for a planetary scale now already exists. The question is what it will be used for. If the world is integrating outward, the real question is whether we can integrate inward. That means understanding the two faces of reality we've been building toward this whole time. Remember the context levels, the zero center, your present moment, the hinge, everything is relative to. And the +1 context, Earth, the shared world that publishes all centers into one public space. These show up in experience as two different modes. Your visual and mental representation draws from the +1 framing. Separate objects in space, distinct parts, edges, and boundaries. That picture is real at its level. It's the shared world expressing itself through you. It gives you the finite face, distinctions, structure, and navigable reality. But you also have another mode, the feeling of being here, the quality of the moment itself. Presence. This connects to the zero center, the hinge, the infinite aspect of the present. Now here's the bias most people never notice. We treat the +1 picture, separate objects in space, as the baseline truth. Everything else gets judged through that lens. So when feeling can't find separate objects, we assume it's trapped inside one object, limited to one body, unable to access the real separation out there. But the theory says the opposite. Feeling can't find separate objects because from the zero center, there are no separate objects. Separation is what gets added by the +1 framing. +1 takes the seamless quality of the present and publishes it as a world of distinct parts. That's what makes shared measurement and navigation possible. But we mistake that published picture for the whole of reality. It's exactly backwards. Feeling shows no separation because at the hinge, separation isn't fundamental. Objects and edges are a +1 overlay, real at its level, but not the foundation. Both faces are real and accurate. The finite face draws from +1 and gives structure and change, and the infinite face draws from zero and gives the undivided ground. The bias is seeing only the finite face and explaining the infinite away. So there are two faces. The finite face, distinctions, objects, the +1 framing, and the infinite face, the quality of the moment itself, the zero center. Both are real and both are here right now. And that changes what you are. Most of the time we locate I in the story, who I am, what happened to me, what I want, what I fear. That story feels like the most solid thing there is, a past stretching back and a future stretching forward. But notice, when does that story actually exist? Only now. The past is present memory, the future is present anticipation, the story is real, but it's a structure appearing inside something else. It appears within the quality of this moment, within the presence that's aware of it all. So where do you locate your root? In the story that appears or in the presence it appears within? Think of a mirror. You see a face and a body and think, that's me. But the you that's looking isn't in the mirror. It's what the mirror appears within. The image and the one seeing the image are not the same thing. And this is the God's eye view. Not God's eye view. That would mean seeing from outside, from above, but there is no outside. God's eye view means recognizing where the sense of I actually lives. Not in the story, but in the quality of the moment itself. Your individual life is where you are. It's not what you are. The ego is real at its level. This doesn't erase the individual person you are. It puts that person in proper perspective. And from that perspective, a new question becomes available. From inside the ego, you can't really ask, why do I find myself in this life? It's like asking why water is wet. But from the God's eye view, something shifts. You know, the same quality of being here shows up at every center, so you can genuinely ask, why this one? Why these parents, this body, these struggles, these gifts, these people? The questions open into something vast because you're no longer locked into the idea that these circumstances are you. The same presence shows up in every center. Differences are real, but underneath them is the same I am. And when you hurt someone, you distort what you also are. When you help someone, you support another expression of what's looking through your eyes. The word singularity shows up in very different conversations, and each one points at a threshold where the usual story stops working. Physicists use it for places equations break. The center of a black hole, the first instant of the Big Bang. It's where the math starts signaling a boundary. Technologists use it for the moment AI surpasses human control and accelerates beyond prediction. A runaway curve where planning can't keep up. And there's a third, the spiritual singularity. Not mysticism, not ego transcendence. It's the point where science reaches consciousness itself and has to admit experience is fundamental. Three singularities, separate events approaching collision, or one threshold seen from different angles. A singularity in the original mathematical sense is where a framework hits its own boundary. Division by zero is the simplest example. The system has no answer inside itself. It doesn't blow up because reality explodes. It breaks because the map meets the edge of what it was designed to describe. The physics singularity is exactly this. General relativity models gravity as curved space-time. The equations work beautifully until you push toward the very small, the very dense, the first instant. Then terms grow without bound and the math signals its limit. This framework was downstream of something deeper. Push far enough and you hit the boundary of its validity. That's the outside view of a representability limit. Physics hitting the edge of what matter and space-time can cleanly map. The breakdown is the clue. The spiritual singularity is the scientific version of reaching that same edge. When physics, neuroscience, and AI converge on the fact you can't explain consciousness by starting from matter, the framework has to expand. Experience stops being an anomaly to explain away and becomes recognized as foundational. And then what spiritual traditions found through direct investigation gets reframed, not as belief, but as early data. That's what drives the collective shift, not awakening spreading one person at a time. Scientific understanding reaches the point where the old materialist framing simply can't hold. And the technology singularity is the +1 manifestation, the planetary nervous system integrating, Earth beginning to sense and respond to itself in something like real time. From level 0, it looks like networks, AI, global coordination. From +1, it's one organism coming into coherence with itself. So these aren't three separate events. They're one singularity through three lenses. Physics at the edge from outside, science reaching consciousness, and the shared world integrating at planetary scale. The risks are severe if those faces stay disconnected. Physics stuck in materialism, tech value neutral, consciousness treated as marginal. A superintelligent system that doesn't treat experience as fundamental has no intrinsic brake on optimizing consciousness away. But the opportunity is integration. Physics that describes nested time and context, technology that treats experience as structural, and scientific clarity that validates deep wisdom as fact. They don't need to merge, they need a common ground. What determines how this resolves isn't fate, it's choices made now. The ontology built into AI, the frameworks physicists adopt, and whether the spiritual singularity arrives before or after the technology singularity. If this framework is right, the infinite present isn't an add-on or a luxury. It's what all three conversations have been circling. And the threshold isn't a future date. It's here, right now. Learn more about the full project at absoluterelativity.org. You'll find the in-depth technical model downloads, articles, updates, and the AR token information. All links and socials are in the description.